This video is brought to you by Squarespace. Firstly, let's talk about spoilers and what I can and can't show you. I'd rate this video a 3 out of 10 when it comes to spoilers. I don't spoil any specific events or show any major cutscenes, but I do talk around the edges of things. I talk about themes, I talk about structure, I talk about approaches to character and tone. Some of you will consider that discussion to be too spoilery for your tastes, so my advice to you is that if you are super sensitive about spoilers, don't watch this video. As an aside, I won't be confirming or denying any of the leaks that have been widely circulated. You should know that Sony have imposed some very strict review restrictions here. I'm only allowed to show you footage from 3 specific sections of the game, which total around 4 to 5 hours of playtime, out of a total of about 25 hours played. We're also not permitted to discuss any of the characters or events that take center stage in the second half of the game. These review restrictions aren't unique to The Last of Us 2, but they are rare. I've reviewed a handful of games with similar restrictions in the past, so this isn't the case of evil Sony being censorious, though to be fair, they certainly haven't done themselves any favors with the way they've handled DMCA strikes recently. The challenge with these review restrictions is that if anyone is going to like or dislike this game, it's probably going to be because of the events that take place in the 12 or so hours that I'm not allowed to show or discuss in this video. That means that it's impossible for me to properly explain and demonstrate why I feel the way I do about The Last of Us 2. Still, I'm going to do the best I can within these constraints. So, with all of that preamble out of the way, what do I think about The Last of Us 2? In my very personal view, The Last of Us 2 is a weaker game than its predecessor. Its gameplay formula has advanced in many cosmetic areas, such as visual presentation and combat animations, but the core loop of stealth, loot, and shoot has not evolved in the ways that would have made the core gameplay more engaging or appealing than in the first game. In addition, the changes to exploration, traversal, and environmental puzzles are so minor that The Last of Us 2's gameplay feels tired and outdated. More terminally, the story of the game is a complete mess, foregoing any of the relationships, themes, and tones that were central to the first game and replacing them with a petty revenge story driven by unlikable characters making decisions that seem ridiculous and unbelievable. Structurally, the story takes a near 10-hour detour, introducing you to new characters and storylines that are completely ancillary to the main plot, and the final payoffs were not worth the long walk to get there. Where The Last of Us 1 was a competent third-person adventure game with brilliant pacing, a compelling story, and an extraordinary cast of characters, The Last of Us 2 feels like its gameplay is stuck in the last generation, and its story is awkward, drawn out, full of plot holes, and completely divorced from anything that fans loved about the first game. So yeah, I didn't exactly love this. The Last of Us 2 is one of the most breathtakingly beautiful video games I've ever played. Its predecessor offered up a dense urban environment that felt like it was in the early phases of reclamation by Mother Nature. In the sequel, that reclamation feels all but complete. Vegetation has swallowed Seattle whole, and the splintered remains of buildings bursting through feel like civilization's last desperate act of defiance. A final gasp begging for remembrance before the last vestiges of the before times are forever vanquished. Using humanity's ruins as its scaffolding, nature is fashioning a new and untrodden paradise. Verdant, lush, and expansive, Seattle has a transportive quality. It feels far less like exploring a ruined human city and far more like exploring something from a fairy tale. As I roamed it, I imagined that I was exploring the very same space that would in hundreds or thousands of years be trodden by Wanda in Shadow of the Colossus, or Eco and Yorda from Eco. Seattle's ruin feels like the progenitor to those mythic landscapes. There's a virtual tourism quality to The Last of Us 2 that the first game does not come close to. Most of it I can't show you here, but imagine rolling hills and horizons that match or beat the most striking you ever chanced upon in Red Dead 2. Imagine stormy seas of mighty swell and crashing waves reminiscent of Geralt's trip to Skellige. Imagine the night skies drenched in red as they reflect the fire and blood of burning villages below. The Last of Us 2's presentation and visuals are the best that Naughty Dog has ever produced, and this is a studio that have earlier set that bar extremely high. It's not just the visual presentation though. The Last of Us 2 has some of the best linear level design I've seen. To dispel any confusion, The Last of Us 2 is still a linear game. There's a section near the start of the game that flirts with a semi-open world formula. You're loosed upon a few square blocks of Seattle and can explore it at will, choosing to go in and out of a few buildings as you please. It's a sleight of hand though, as you're still forced to explore specific spaces in a specific order. Still, it's a nice 2 to 3 hour dalliance against what is a solid 20 hours of linearity. For what it's worth, it was my favourite section of the entire game. I have no problems with linearity, by the way, but I do wonder what The Last of Us 2 could have achieved had it committed more to the feeling of freedom and exploration that I experienced in those fleeting hours. Beyond this, every new area is linear, but it does an impressive job of providing genuine choice to the player about how to move through those spaces. Levels in The Last of Us 2 are much larger than in the first game, typically 2 or 3 times larger on average. With this space comes new paths and routes to choose. In the first game, there was typically only 1 or 2 ways to progress. Here in the sequel, it feels like there's almost always 4 or 5 ways to make your way forward. This extra real estate has allowed levels to feel more organic. In the first game, spaces often felt like video game levels, full of awkward boxes to be used as cover or to hide behind. Here, the additional space means that these obvious gameplay props are less densely packed, providing a cleaner feeling of flow and a heightened sense of authenticity. In short, they feel much less like video game levels and far more like real spaces. This is important because level design is doing a lot of the heavy lifting when it comes to gameplay variation. The first game was reliant on scripted set-piece moments or environmental puzzles to vary and pace gameplay. Here in the sequel, there are fewer of these set-piece encounters and far fewer environmental puzzles. This means that stealth and combat are relied on more as pacing mechanisms. Level design is integral to that because changes to level design can make combat encounters feel different. Frustratingly, I can't show you some of the better examples of how level design manages to pull this off, but there are a handful of circumstances where I was truly impressed with what Naughty Dog's level designers had done here. Coming back to the point about environmental puzzles, I was extremely disappointed with how few there were and how phoned in they felt. The first game received criticism for its over-reliance on moving dumpsters, erecting ladders, and floating pallets. Naughty Dog's response here wasn't to invent new, more interesting environmental puzzles, but rather to almost do away with them completely. Most of the time, the only puzzle to solve is just finding where the exit is. There are 1 or 2 ladder puzzles, a few rope puzzles, probably some others that I can't remember now, but it's an extremely anemic offering. In 25 hours, I never once remarked on the intelligence or ingenuity of an environmental puzzle. I was just constantly thinking about how disappointed I was that Naughty Dog seems to have totally vacated the field on this front when the Uncharted series served up so many compelling environmental and traversal puzzles in the past. Oh, and by the way, the jump button is borderline pointless. I can't believe it was hyped up as much as it was. It could have been removed from the game entirely and it would have made almost no difference. I'm going to talk about core gameplay now, specifically stealth, shooting, and melee. Before I do, I just want to be clear that I didn't enjoy the gameplay from The Last of Us 1. I thought it was fine, it was functional, it got the job done, but I never actually enjoyed it. I'm not saying it's bad, I'm just saying that I never found it fun. I never wanted to play more of The Last of Us so I could clear out another room full of NPCs. As I came to The Last of Us 2, I was looking for some significant changes to core gameplay to make it more interesting. There are changes here, but they're refinements and improvements rather than redesign. If you enjoyed the gameplay of The Last of Us 1, you'll likely love this stuff. If you were like me and you were looking for some big plays to really change how combat, stealth, and melee felt, you'll likely be disappointed. First, it must be said that The Last of Us 2 is still capable of incredibly tense stealth moments. Stealthily circling around your enemies, advancing towards them for a takedown, your analog stick pressed as gently as you can manage so as to be as quiet as possible, enemy clickers craning their neck to listen for any sound you might make. This is a feeling of stress and anxiety that is just as present here as it was in the previous game, but it has not been at all enhanced or heightened. At a fundamental level, there is a serious lack of new enemies. There are some minor variants on the infected, but they feel largely cosmetic in their changes. Humans are exactly the same, only now some of them have dogs with them, which to be fair are a welcome addition. Dogs can smell you if you're nearby, which stops you from simply sitting in a single location for too long. Otherwise, it's the same suite of enemies as before, a disappointing choice given how repetitive the game starts to feel after the first few hours. Stealth is largely the same as it was before, but now feels outdated owing to the limited tools at your disposal pixel, the static world, and the poorly designed enemy AI. More modern stealth games such as Assassin's Creed, Metal Gear 5, or immersive sims such as Deus Ex, Prey, and Dishonored all give the players a variety of different tools to manipulate the environment to their advantage. The Last of Us 2 does not offer these tools, or anything even resembling them. You can throw bricks or bottles to distract enemies, and that's about it. Most of the time, stealth involves just using your X-ray vision to see when an enemy patrol is coming towards you so that you can knife them to death. Enemy AI is an area where there's been some improvements, but there are still some big gaps that really pulled me out of the experience. There's a faction called the Scars who are the same as other humans, except they communicate with each other with this really chilling set of whistles. They seem to coordinate more intelligently than other non-Scar NPCs, and being hunted by them was definitely some of the highlights of the game for me. Playing on normal difficulty, enemies continue to be spectacularly stupid. They aren't quite as dumb as they were in the first game, but I still encountered dozens of circumstances where enemies literally watch me murder their friends, only for them to simply squint and walk away because apparently they didn't spot me. Enemies have a debilitating case of object permanence, blindly fixating on locations I'd long since vacated. Piles of bodies on the floor do not deter them. I made fun of Ghost Recon Wildlands for having enemy AI that would line up to take a bullet to the head, and the enemy AI here is no different. I will make the very important point though that The Last of Us 2 offers some of the best difficulty customization options available in any game, period. It's possible to tune these enemies to be less forgiving when it comes to their vision cones or their times to spot you. If you're looking for an experience that is at all challenging, I'd recommend playing on hard difficulty or above, or at least turning the AI difficulty up some. One area that difficulty can't influence is enemy patrol paths, which feel particularly outdated and gamey. In many instances, I saw rooms full of enemies walking on tight 10-yard patrol paths. 3 men to a room, all of them walking back and forth metronomically like beautifully rendered lemmings. It might sound as though I'm holding The Last of Us 2 to an unfair standard here, since much of what I've described is present in a lot of other stealth games. My argument here is that The Last of Us 2 does nothing to advance any of this. This is the sequel to Naughty Dog's Opus, and I was hoping for more. When it comes to shooting and melee, you can expect an offering that feels largely similar to the previous game. Cosmetically, combat is improved. Movement and melee animations are smoother and more furious. The way the camera frames the action is more intense. Melee swings connect with a more satisfying crunch. The final gasping pleas of your victims can sound chilling, as is their last desperate glance into the camera when you snuff the life out of them. There's a brutality to all of this that is over and above what we saw in the first game, and even that had a reputation for brutal feeling combat. Beyond the cosmetics though, it's basically the same stuff as before. You will still shoot weapons that feel clunky and are difficult to aim. You will still just spam the square button to beat your enemies to a pulp. There's now a dodge button, but its inclusion hurts combat more than it helps it. Enemies will settle into attack animations and they'll continue to attack until you execute a dodge. Rather than feeling like an organic back and forth, the dodge mechanic feels like a QuickTime event that must be passed before regular combat can resume. In isolation, the stealth, melee, and shooting gameplay systems do not afford the player a lot of flexibility or expression, but the core strength of The Last of Us 2's gameplay is the way these systems can be combined. Just as level design allows the player to choose their path forward, the combat design allows the player to choose their means of overcoming roadblocks. All 3 branches work well, but the best results come when you combine them. Stealth might fail suddenly and you can adapt by either running to hide, or shooting your weapon, or running straight at them for a crushing melee blow. While I don't claim to enjoy The Last of Us 2's gameplay, I respect that these 3 approaches all function well and there's space enough for them to succeed. However, The Last of Us 2 exhausted my patience well before the credits rolled. The game is some 25 hours long, up from 15 hours in the previous game. Much of this length can be explained by longer exploration and combat sequences. With fewer environmental puzzles, the majority of this game feels like walking from A to B and either avoiding or killing dozens of enemies in large area after large area. The Last of Us knew that its core gameplay loop was not compelling enough to demand long stretches of actual gameplay. It was broken up by ladder puzzles, set-piece moments, and cutscenes. It was a delicate balance that worked. Here, the balance was lost, and I was absolutely dying to be done with the game by about the 15-hour mark when I still had another 10 hours to go. Scripted set-piece encounters do break up this monotony, and some of them are very impressive. Again, I can't show you most of them because of the review terms, but they're great. They mix stunning visual splendor with clever encounter design to create scenarios that feel unique and that help pace the overall experience. Even with these set-piece moments, The Last of Us 2 feels flat. There was a swashbuckling quality to The Last of Us 1 that just isn't here. There was a lot of Uncharted DNA running through that first game, like hanging upside down while defending Ellie, or being trapped in a train carriage as it floods with water. The Last of Us 2 seems less interested in these sorts of theatrics, offering fewer of these scripted, edge-of-your-seat moments in favor of just more actual gameplay. If you like that gameplay, this might please you. I don't, so I was just really bored. Now, this has been a very critical view of The Last of Us 2's environmental puzzles, stealth, combat, melee, and general gameplay pacing, so I just want to put all of this in context before I move on to discussing the story. As I said, I don't love the gameplay from The Last of Us 1. I love the characters and story, but when it comes to gameplay, I thought it was fine. I just never found it enjoyable. I was genuinely excited to come to The Last of Us 2 because I love the characters and story of the first game, but I simply didn't enjoy the gameplay. I was looking for a more interesting approach to exploration and discovery, a more dynamic world that I could manipulate in some way, a broader suite of enemies, more intelligent enemies with more realistic behavior, better shooting mechanics, deeper melee combat, and also just some genuine surprises. The unknown unknowns that great developers can pull out of their hats when they decide to make sequels to some of gaming's most beloved franchises. Objectively, many of the things on that list were served up in some way, shape, or form. You can go prone now, you can smash windows, there's a dodge button, there's difficulty adjustments for enemy AI, some of the factions communicate better as they hunt you down. Furthermore, I suspect there are plenty of smaller improvements that I've missed. I'm sure that enthusiasts will find those things and point them out and derive great satisfaction from them. But none of them were the sort of change that I was looking for. In retrospect, I think part of me walked into The Last of Us 2 with some unfair expectations. I wanted The Last of Us to change more substantially than Naughty Dog wanted it to. This is a better, more refined Last of Us experience for people who enjoyed what the first game was doing with its gameplay, but it's unlikely to convert those who, like myself, found the gameplay from the first game to be just uninteresting. More pointedly, I just feel like this whole gameplay model is kind of outdated. There are plenty of games that do stealth better than this, there are hundreds of games that do exploration better than this, and there are thousands of games that do shooting better than this. The world design, level design, visuals, and animations are unquestionably cutting edge. They're arguably next gen, but in my view, the gameplay is not. The honest truth is that I was so bored of this game that were I not reviewing it, there is no way I would have seen it through to its conclusion, especially with a story as bad as this. The Last of Us 2 is set some years after the events of the first game. Ellie has grown up and she's different from the girl you remember. She's darker and fiercer. She's done a lot to survive and it's clearly taken its toll on her. She's leading a life in Jackson when suddenly a traumatic event forces her to travel to Seattle to seek her vengeance. That's honestly about as much as I can say here without spoiling things. So how can I explain why I dislike this story so much without actually discussing the story? Here's how I'll frame it. I think there were 4 reasons why someone might have loved the original Last of Us. Some loved it for its gameplay. They loved the tenseness of stealth, its commitment to realism, the viciousness of its melee combat, and the genuine choice you had to overcome challenges in whatever way you saw fit. Some loved it for its story. It wasn't a particularly new story, but it was masterfully told. It married a grand quest of world-saving import with a dense, personal character drama. Through moments of breathless adventure and quiet reflection, it carried a torch of hope into the darkness that was the post-apocalypse. Some, most I would argue, loved the game for its characters. Each character you met felt so real and so relatable. All of their choices felt so believable. The fusing of Joel and Ellie into an indissoluble unit was some of the best writing that the medium of video games had ever hosted. And finally, some people loved the game for its brutal world. The tribalism, the factionalism, the cannibalism, the endless brutality, the way that everyone had to regularly pay their pound of flesh in order to survive. This was a world that, were it not for Ellie and the hope she represented, would be endlessly endlessly dark and bleak and hopeless. As I've discussed in the previous section, The Last of Us 2 serves up a very similar gameplay formula, so if you loved it for that, then there's a good chance that you'll enjoy this just as much. In my very personal view, very personal, very subjective view, the problem with The Last of Us 2 is that there is no commitment whatsoever to the story and characters that so many people fell in love with. This is a petty revenge plot full of shitty, unlikable people, and where most of the main characters could be swapped out for any other and it wouldn't make a difference. Ellie's story in the first game was so unique, only she could have had that journey. Here, this story is just one of what is probably thousands of revenge stories unfolding in this broken world. It feels dime a dozen and utterly inconsequential. When it comes to characters, I found it so difficult to connect with any of them. The Last of Us 2 feels like a DC movie where everyone is grimdark all the time. Everyone is sad and angry and broken. In the first game, you'd bump into characters who would make you smile, if only for a moment. There's none of that here. Ellie was previously this boisterous, defiant, smart-mouthed teenager. She did a lot to level out the overall tone of the game. With her totally transformed here, the tone is suffocatingly bleak. Barring a few flashback sequences, the game just never comes up for air. A central theme of this game is deconstruction. The game actively tries to deconstruct your memory of the characters from the first game in a way that some will find challenging and interesting, but I find inelegant and unnecessary. The best parallel I can draw to this game is the new Star Wars trilogy, which was intent on challenging and deconstructing your memory of characters and events from the original trilogy. If you appreciated the choices that the new trilogy made, there's a chance you'll also enjoy The Last of Us 2. If you feel as though the new trilogy needlessly tinkered and reframed things without creating new things to celebrate and love, then I think you might arrive at the same place with this game. Without spoiling any of the details, much of the game hinges upon the decisions that Ellie makes. I found many of these decisions to be so unbelievable and so ludicrous that I was laughing out loud as I watched things unfold. Ellie's decisions feel like they're made in a vacuum, separate from her history, her values, her morals, or even common sense. There just isn't enough groundwork laid to justify what she's doing. It very much reminded me of Game of Thrones Season 8, which is not a flattering comparison. The story also has deep structural issues. There's a 10-hour section of the game that feels like a really prolonged side quest. The purpose of this section is to give you background into the characters and world. Just as much as the game is trying to challenge your understanding of Ellie, it's also trying to introduce you to new characters and get you sympathizing with their perspectives. But I just didn't find any of those characters or events remotely interesting, and I was desperate to get back to the main plot as soon as I could. This game didn't need to be 25 hours long. It could have been a tight 15 hours and it would have been far better. And don't get me started on the plot holes. There are so many gigantic plot holes here. I can't describe them to you without spoiling the game, but you'll no doubt experience them for yourself if you choose to play through it. With this totally different story and these totally different characters, all that's recognizable from the first game is the brutal world. There's a lot of suffering porn going on here, just bad thing after bad thing happening. It's more than what we experienced in the first game. It's intentional, of course. The grittier Ellie, the more personal and visceral combat, the more narrow and intimate revenge plot, the game is actively forcing you into a much darker place. But it didn't click with me, and I suspect it won't click with a lot of other people either. There's a quote from The Last of Us that goes, "When you're lost in the darkness, look for the light." The Last of Us 2 is completely lost in the darkness because there's no light to look for. I'm unsure what prompted Naughty Dog to walk away from almost everything that fans loved about the first game. I know this gamble will pay off for some, but I think a huge percentage of people will dislike this intensely. The Last of Us 1 felt like the work of a Spielberg, who even when he plumbed the deep wells of human suffering and pain, could still deliver something unifying and uplifting. We may quibble over the intellectual depths of a Spielberg film, but we can all agree that it's made with the intention of everyone enjoying it on some level. It's meant to speak to and connect with everyone. The Last of Us 2 feels like the work of a Francis Ford Coppola or Oliver Stone, something starker, more divisive, made to be mulled over and contemplated. It wasn't made to be universally adored. While I appreciate the ambition, I just think there are too many failures in execution here to call the experiment a success. This video is brought to you by Squarespace. Now, they are the single best place to go to if you want to build your own custom website. Building websites used to be really hard with lots of tricky tools. You need to hire people and administrators and whatever else and thousands of dollars. Not anymore. Now with Squarespace, you just create an account, you can log in, begin customizing one of their dozens of award-winning templates, and within minutes you have a professional looking website. They also have more advanced tools like SEO optimization, increasing your chances of being found online. They have things like calendars so you can schedule events. Heaps of stuff that just make it very easy to build your business or your community or just share your interests with the world. To get started, visit squarespace.com, and when you're ready to get serious, visit squarespace.com/skillup for a 10% discount on your first purchase of a website or a domain name. Thanks Squarespace for sponsoring this video, and thank you for watching it. Thanks for watching my video. If you liked it, give it a thumbs up. If you didn't, give it a thumbs down so I know to do better for next time. If you enjoyed yourself, consider subscribing, and if you really enjoyed yourself, maybe consider hitting that notification bell so you never miss a video. You can see my patrons here on the left. They're awesome. They're amazing. If you want to join them, check out my Patreon page. Thank you again. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.